good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming here. I'm also thankful that I was able to make it. I just literally arrived from Singapore. So it's my way of saying, go easy on me. So I'm going to talk about return migration and, to some extent, intergenerational relations. And this, to some extent, is a departure from the earlier presentations. And particularly because, one, I'm going to talk about one of the most understudied aspects of migration, is return migration. And I'm going to look at it from a different angle. I'll explain later. The second one is I'm looking at it from the perspective of policy. As you can see, I'm from a public policy school. And I wanted to look at how policies and programs of the government fit into the return migration strategies of migrant workers. So this is my very simple outline. I'm just going to talk about the motivation. I'm going to frame it from a transnationalist perspective. Then I'm going to talk about the results of my interviews with a few domestic migrant workers working in Singapore and Switzerland. And then I'll discuss everything in terms of the stories that I derived from the interviews. So I'm taking it from the perspective of trying to explain one aspect of common discourse in the Philippines about migrant workers, that most of migrant workers are unable to financially prepare for their return. This is an article since 2002 that talk about migrant workers returning broke and broken. So they talk about how they're unable to save, at the same time how they're emotionally distressed upon their return. So official estimates talk about, this is a survey of official overseas Filipino workers, or OFWs, that only less than half of OFWs are able to save during their migration, and they're only able to save less than 25% of their cash remittance. So that's very, very little. And in the context of migrant workers, the minimum wage is about $400 US. So you can just make the computation that about 25% are about, just compute for it. And it's very, very minimal, considering that most of these have to go through indebtedness throughout their migration process. And such behavior of an inability to save is always attributed to lack of financial discipline. They always blame the migrant workers that you're not prudent, you're not saving enough, you're probably spending too much while you're abroad. And advocates of financial literacy programs would say that you need to disabuse the concept of pasalubong, which is homecoming gift. You need to disabuse the concept of remittance. And you need to disabuse the concept of regular visits in order for them to be able to save. But I find this to be, I would wish to question this and find this to be inadequate in terms of explaining this kind of behavior among migrant workers. So just going back to literature, return migration can be framed as a constant process of renegotiation of space for their return. Transnationalists would view return migration as part and parcel of a circular system. They would always return back to their home country of social and economic relationship and exchange, facilitating reintegration. So if for temporary migrant workers, such as domestic workers, who would have typically a contract of 2 years, return and reintegration is part and parcel of their migration process. They will definitely return. And on literature looking at the effect of return migration on the family left behind, it's always been positive. While there are a lot of studies that look at the effect of migration on shadow families, migration on strained familiar relationships, most of the return migration literature would say that it actually improves investment on human capital. They tend to invest more on their child's education. They tend to be able to be more confident to provide familial advice, so it improves familial relations, and make financial investments to sustain livelihood. They tend to be more self-employed. They manage their own businesses. But this stream of research offers a less complex explanation of the relationship between return migration and the effect on the left behind. Unsurprisingly, they look at the effect upon return. But I wish to look at it from a different angle, because if return strategies is embedded in the migration process, they strategize on their return from the moment that they leave the country. They strategize for their return once they're in Singapore, for example, their first year. So I wanted to look at this mechanism and try to thresh out eventually the effect on intergenerational relationships. And current research would look at this mechanism in the context of determinants of return migration. So they look at the extent of reintegration in the host country. They would typically say that those are less integrated politically, economically, and socially in the countries, in the host countries, would tend to return. And those with, this was a research done by an economist on exchange rate shocks, that those that with higher levels of possibility of earning in terms of cash remittance, there will be less likelihood of return. So if they can earn more and send more, they would least likely to return. But if you look at the common reasons for return among Filipino migrant workers, it's beyond these two factors. You can see their family problems. So this underpins the importance of looking at transnational family ties. And this is where my policy background comes in. We looked at reintegration and return programs, and they typically view return migration as the end of the migration cycle. There are savings programs, housing loans, retooling programs, job assistance programs, but all of these are offered upon return. So if you view return migration as a constant process throughout the migration process, this might be a little too late. Yeah. So these are my main research question. I wish to rephrase this first question. That I wanted to look at how return migration strategies intermediate the relationship between return migration and intergenerational relations. And I wanted to look at how do current migrant workers prepare for the end of their migration, and how do state-sanctioned reintegration programs fit into the return strategies of the migrant worker. So I interviewed 12 Filipino household service workers, so this is what the Philippine government is calling the domestic helpers now, in Singapore and Switzerland. So to explain why there's a long variance in the dates, I actually started this research while I was in Switzerland, then I continued it when I returned to Singapore. So it's also a story of return for me. And there's actually various age range. There's one who's like 29 years old up to like 50 years old. And it gives me sort of a rich account of to what extent does migrant worker plan for their return during the stage of their migration process. So these are my findings. This is just a confirmation of what we already know about transnationalism and migration, is that it's about a constant readjustment of migration motivation, and hence we'd like to argue that it's also a constant readjustment of return motivation. So intention for migration is inevitably linked with the intention to return. And you can see here, Marivic talked about her intention of going abroad, that she's not poor, they won't go hungry, but she decided to migrate to provide good education for her son. And then she returned after 4 years to take care of her son, but decided to go back because she actually missed the idea of working. The day-to-day grind of waking up at 5 a.m., sleeping at 10 p.m. She missed that compared to, she called it living like a princess back in the Philippines because she was a full-time housewife. So as a result, they engage in this continuous process of readjustment that when I asked them, like, how long did you initially plan to migrate? They would always say 2 years. Just one contract, 2 years, I'm done. But they would always say, it's not enough. I wasn't able to save. There's just different, it would just change. Like for example, Marivic was able to send her son to school. He already graduated. but he's still migrating. And I asked her why. Because I need to take care of my mom. And so this one is interesting about Marites. She's a fairly different kind of household service worker. She was employed in Japan, but her employer decided to bring her to Singapore when they moved to Singapore. And it's typically the case for some domestic helpers, where they engage in stepwise migration together with their employer. And I know of people who move from Jordan, eventually move to the US when their employer eventually also migrated to the US. And they would always say that at least 3 of the interviewers would talk about how much they enjoy being in Singapore, and they don't want to return just yet. And when I ask them, are you prepared to return? Like, maybe, maybe not. They have a rough idea of what they want to do upon their return. I have to emphasize that. They have a rough idea of what they want to do upon their return, but it's not as concrete as some would have. So they always reframe their return plans to their family. So this goes back to the argument that it's about transnational ties. It's not about wages. It's not about being able to earn a living back home. It's about going back home and taking care of their family. So Josephine talked about, I want to be with my mother. I want to be able to take care of my mother when she's already ailing. And Agnes, who's fairly younger, said that she plans to get married upon her return. And most plans would involve self-employment, which to some extent confirms the earlier studies. And this is interesting because at least 2 of them talked about how their employers taught them how to cook and how to manage a restaurant. And they have sort of an idea of what they want to do, but it's not so clear. For example, Chrissy said that they haven't talked about it. And it depends, I saw a trend that it depends on where they are in their migration duration. Like if, for example, there's Julie, who's 50 years old, who's been migrating for 20 years, she's very more clear. She wanted to come up with a student dormitory. She knows how much she's going to need for capital. She knows how to construct the student dormitory, where to construct it, and there's a demand for it. So it depends. And Agnes, compared to her, her plan for return is just to get married. So it differs across experience of migration. And this, for me, is one of the more interesting aspects of it, that people talk about how their family relations were strained, but at the same time talk about migration as an escape from that strained familiar relations. And this is Sophia talking about the fact that her husband can chase after her in Singapore because her husband needs to have a passport, buy an air ticket, which is expensive. As compared when she was in Manila working as a factory worker, her husband can easily just get on the bus and go to Manila and talk about the problem. I didn't explore what problem was this. And there was someone who's, I think it was Irene, who said that migration for her is, I'm going to say it in Filipino, takbuhan at takasan ang sakit. So it means running away and breaking away from the pain, the torment of her forced marriage. So she got pregnant before getting married, and they were forced to get married. And for her, she saw migration as an escape. She didn't return, actually, for 4 years. And she framed her return to actually take something back from take back something that was taken away from her. They had a child, and the husband was the one who's taking care of it. And she doesn't want to reconcile the relationship. So she was trying to take back the child. So she returned twice. The first time she was unsuccessful, and the second one was where she was successful. So when it is an escape, they engage in transnational practices to rekindle, reinforce strained familiar relations. So, for example, Marivic talked about her regular visits. That is about family bonding activities. They would go at the beach. They would go to the supermarket, buy everything for all the members of her family. Crazy would talk about birthday parties. She would always try to make it back to her son's birthday parties because it's an important life event. So for them, transnational practices is actually a way for them to create the space for their return. So when I asked Julie about, is she prepared? She said no. She said actually yes, because her regular visits every year would allow her to adjust to the environment. This is the one I interviewed in Switzerland. She said there's a difference in climate, there's a difference in pollution, and going back every year allows her to adjust to that kind of lifestyle, and eventually to her eventual return. When I asked about what are your greatest concerns upon your return, it's always about being able to keep that identity that they formed when they were abroad back home. So they formed their identity as the main source of income of the family, and they want to keep that. So they're very afraid of losing income. Crazy talk about magpalayo ang loob, meaning basically estrangement from their kids. So that's why she would always go back to the Philippines for her kid's birthday, because she's always afraid of that they won't recognize her anymore. And many talk about broken family, and in Filipino it's interesting to say it's called nangapit bahay. So basically they moved to the neighbor's house, or basically had an extramarital affairs with their neighbor. So there is a desire to keep the kind of mobility enjoyed in migration, and they always talk about, I don't want to go back to nothing. I don't want to go back to just eating banana. So they just want to keep that identity that they were able to form, transnational identity they were able to form through migration upon their return. And this, I think, is one of the biggest factors that would intermediate the relationship between return migration and intergenerational relationships, is that if they actually engage in renegotiation of space for their return, and with the family as their locus, it has become a social return or exchange of favors, or an exchange of obligations for care. So almost everyone talked about it's going to be a family. And this one, he said, Ma, it's our turn to help you or take care of you. My younger siblings tell me, Ate, which means older sister, as soon as we graduate, you can take a break from working in Singapore. And this one, I tell them, the money I am using to send you to school is for my retirement. So it's basically saying that I'm actually compromising my return for you, for sending you to school. And she finds the reassurances from her state, from the nieces and the nephews, that they said that we will pay you back, Tita, we will take care of you. So this, I think, is one of the unexplored aspect of return migration that you couldn't really understand when once they've already returned. You wouldn't realize how much they would exchange their identity, how they would try to connect their identities and exchange and practice transnational practices in order to create a space for their return. And just quickly, we find that government programs do not actually fit into the return strategies only until the end of their migration cycle. I wasn't able. This means that I don't know about that. When I was asking about programs, specific programs, I would say, do you know about the savings program? They really don't know, especially if they're fairly young in their migration process. But when, for example, Julie, she decided to get one, a medical insurance, because she knows that she would need that, because it would actually be a shock to her source of income. But interestingly, some were able to enroll into a financial literacy and business management program during their migration, when they were in Singapore. And this, for these people, they were actually able to say what their concrete plans are. They have a business plan, they know their market, they know how much they want to do. So this could feed in eventually to their migration strategies. So just to conclude, we find that migrant workers actively engage in transnational practices to create a space for their return. And it's very hard to disentangle between being just a migrant and doing this, sending cash remittances, and actual return migration. That for me is something that I'm conceptually grappling with. But for temporary migrant workers, this is very important because return is guaranteed for everyone. And the two factors that I find that would intermediate return migration and intergenerational relations are the transnational practices that they do and the exchange of social obligation of care. So yeah, so while return programs can alleviate challenges of integration, it doesn't fit into current migrant workers' return migration strategies. So thank you. That's my conclusion.
Thank you so much for your presentations, like Sami and Kichi's presentations. In many ways, they sort of complement each other. One is setting up, looking at how the government constructs migrant workers, using these discourses of responsible families and things like that. And then Kichi sort of looking at how the return programs fail to address the kinds of fundamental issues that migrant workers are faced with. So I'm interested in opening up the floor to any questions or comments for presenters for their interesting presentations like Samia's presentation and Kichi's presentation. So if anyone would like to raise a question for each of the presenters or for one of the presenters, and then we can start the conversation. Any questions?
Can I start? We have heard in Yanis Adams' presentation about the role of religion, especially mosques and the Catholic Church for Filipinos. How does what role does the church play in your case in welcoming Filipinos back? Is there a reintegration program? And in your case, Samia, you mentioned, especially in the quote, the importance of how these trainers speak about that you need a strong faith in order not to become morally corrupt. Did you follow this a little bit up? What role faith or how much women are actually practicing?
So actually, I wasn't able to explain that part of the domestic helpers I was able to interview were members of a Christian group. So I would go to their Zumba practices or after Mass, and I would just start talking to them. It's more of storytelling. And what I find is that for some, it's not the case for everyone. The religious practices also prepares them for their eventual return. So for example, Julie, who I interviewed actually in Switzerland, said that when she was in the Philippines before migrating, she was doing some Sunday outreach. And she looked for that space in Switzerland, and she was actively looking for that. And when she found this group, that's when she decided to actually stay in Switzerland. Mm-hmm. And for her, when I asked her about her return plans, she also talked about being active in church. Mm-hmm. This was less prevalent in other cases, but I think that's where religious practices will come in.
Yeah, I'm first and foremost interested in the practices of governing, right? So I found a lot of religious discourse or symbols in the enhancement of work ethos, like they're told working is worship. or also and that touched me also a lot. You pray and then you can keep focus. And for me that was interesting because I was doing, while I was doing my research, I of course also was really trying hard and being focused because I had to gain all this information within this month that I was there, and I could really feel that I was quite affected by this whole mental preparation in a sense too, and that work. But I would say that it would be too, like I would not be satisfied from my own work just to look at religion only as like an instrument of control. I think it is in there, but I also found some powerful instances. For example, before groups of trainees were going abroad, they would have a last get together and pray together. And sorry, it's not Yasinam, but I cannot remember the name of it right now. But these are quite powerful, and I think also like necessary for surviving and for preparing them together. And I mean the effects, the inter-affective situation that was created there was really powerful. So I could relate also quite well to not only the role of religion in the sense of surviving and resilience, but in a way more of that. I don't know, but I want to go into it. And then of course, yes, the communities in Hong Kong are also faith-based. Like in Nevada, the end of the Ramadan is also celebrated, and these are moments that are of course very important. I think I want to go into it, but it can be entangled and spotted in many different ways.
Could you say how this intersects with gender? Because I think, you said in the mosque on Friday there was little going on, but then in public spaces when the Eid was celebrated there was much more participation. Is it because it's perhaps more a female thing to support each other through religion, or why is it that the mosque was so empty on Friday?